Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach. So we often think of history in isolation. Something that happened, its own little glass jar, it's contained, it's isolated. But for the American Jewish community in April 1865, history was experienced not in isolation, but through the lens of our Luach. On April 10th, news broke out and spread immediately that General Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. And of course, upon reading that, I went to the internet, and within about 2 seconds, I have the Jewish calendar of April 1865. So I can tell you that that year, it was a Monday, and that was Erev Pesach. That morning, that news spread that Lee had finally surrendered at Appomattox, the horrible civil war, over 600,000 killed, was over. And we can only imagine for the Jews of that era, of that day, how poetic the timing was. This was the morning before the first Seder, and that night, it would be very easy to have in mind, how is this night different from all other nights? And it's incredible that the most ancient festival of freedom, before their very eyes, was merging with the modern festival of freedom as the Civil War drew to a close. But of course, this peak of a national hallel, if you will, of the country exploding in joy over the liberation, we know from our perspective, it would only be a few days until it all came crashing with a kinah, with an elegy. Because if Lee surrendered on Erev Pesach, that means that on Shabbat, Chol, HaMoed, Pesach, President Lincoln would die. And today, Shabbat, Chol, HaMoed, Pesach is the 161st yahrzeit of President Lincoln. At 7:22 a.m. on Shabbat morning, he died. Edwin Stanton was sobbing. He famously said, "Now he belongs to the ages." Though many have also said that, in fact, he really said, "Now he belongs to the angels." But either way is correct. He had passed into eternity. And we can only imagine what it was like, except thank God we don't only have to imagine. There was a journalist named Bertram Korn, and in his publication, he described the scene that Shabbat morning. Jews were on their way to synagogue or already worshiping when tidings of the assassination reached them. Jews who had not planned on going to shul that morning quickly joined their brethren in the sanctuaries. Everyone needed to find comfort in this hour of grief. Rabbis put their sermons aside and spoke extemporaneously, haltingly, reaching out for words to express their deep sorrow. Samuel Adler of Temple Emmanuel in New York began to deliver a sermon, but he was so overcome that he simply could not continue. Alfred T. Jones, Parnas of Beth El Emeth Congregation of Philadelphia, asked the well-known scholar and writer of the time, Isaac Leeser, to say something to comfort the worshipers. He tried, but it was so disconnected that he apologized. He said to the people, "The dreadful news and its suddenness have in great measure overcome my usual composure, and my thoughts refuse to arrange themselves in their wonted order." At Congregation Shaarey Israel in Manhattan, something happened that had never happened before. Their equivalent of, it's a Spanish-Portuguese synagogue, so of course it has the Sephardic rite, but it's the equivalent of our Kel Mole, the memorial prayer called the Hashkabah. And for the first time ever, certainly in that shul, but to anyone's knowledge ever, the congregation decided at that moment to say a Kel Mole, as it were, for President Lincoln. I don't know what's worse, that he wasn't Jewish or that he was Ashkenaz, but either way, it was a very big step for them, and a controversial one. It might seem like a no-brainer, like, of course, but it wasn't. Now, we know that since the beginning of our country, the Passover story has always been linked to that of the American story. Indeed, Ben Franklin first suggested that the seal of the United States depict Pharaoh drowning at the Red Sea, and that the motto of the new country should be rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. Matthew Holbreich, who's a scholar in this area, wrote that even before the Civil War, Lincoln himself frequently drew on the same biblical imagery to predict the possibility of divine punishment for slavery. In his eulogy for Henry Clay in 1852, Lincoln reflected that Pharaoh's country was cursed with plagues, and his hosts were drowned in the Red Sea for striving to retain a captive people who already served them more than 400 years. May such disasters never befall the United States. And Lincoln always envisioned the eradication of slavery in terms of a moral resurrection. Now, as was mentioned earlier, one could say it's a coincidence, but of course, the Hebrew word for coincidence, mikra, which means something that just happened, if you switch around the letters, means kara me Hashem. It didn't just happen. It happened from God. The Haftorah that we read this morning is the Haftorah about the reanimation of the people from the famous dry bones into living, breathing, and godly people, people who are infused with the Ruach Adonai, with the Spirit of God. And the Haftorah goes through Pasuk 14, but what's amazing is if you continue the chapter 37 in Yechezkel, in Ezekiel, it's even more of a connection, because it isn't just these dry bones, these dry bones that are reanimated into people who want to be connected to God and move and do great things. But the prophet explicitly says, "Hinei ani lokeach et etz Yosef asher biyad Ephraim v'shiftei Yisrael chavirav v'natati otam alav et etz Yehuda v'asitim la'etz echad v'hayu echad biyadi v'hayu ha'etzim asher tichtov alehem b'yodcha le'eneihem." Ve'asiti otam legoy echad ba'aretz b'harei Yisrael umelech echad yihiyeh lechulam ve'lo yiyeh od lishnei goyim ve'lo yechatzu od lishtei mamlachot od. The prophet is talking about the fact that one of the reasons the Bnei Israel, the Jewish people, ended up in exile is because they split into two. They were meant to be one united country, but they split into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And in the process of being reanimated through this miracle, it says explicitly, the people need to have one government. V'lo yihye od lishnei goyim, and there will no longer be a split. V'lo yechatzu od lishtei mamlachot od. So on Shabbat, Chol HaMoed, Pesach, on the very day that is the yahrzeit of President Lincoln, the verse after a few verses where the Haftorah ends explicitly says that we shall be reunited, and what was split will no longer be split, will become once again one polity, one sovereign country, not two. And so, 3,276 years or so after the original Pesach, after the Exodus, and 161 years after the assassination of President Lincoln, on this Shabbat Chol HaMoed Pesach, it behooves us to think about what are we doing? How can we facilitate a new birth of freedom as Americans, as Jews, as diaspora Jews who yearn to support our brethren in the state of Israel? What can we do to facilitate, to support, to strengthen this birth of freedom, so that with our collective amazing efforts, the ability of Israel and the United States of America, the combined efforts, we can work to make sure that this birth of freedom shall not perish from the earth. Shabbat Shalom.